Hey everyone, and welcome to SkillCap's guide on the best graphics, sound, and interface settings for World of Warcraft PvP to give you a competitive edge on your opponents. By the end of this guide, you'll have WoW set up perfectly to ensure that you can see, hear, and control everything in the way pros do. And these settings are not just one person's opinion. We've spent countless hours researching the best pro player settings and consulted with the top players in the game to make sure the information you're about to receive is the most up-to-date and accurate as possible. Trust me, we promise you that there are some hidden settings you've never even heard of before that will give you a competitive edge. Now, we here at SkillCap release plenty of premium content every week to keep you up to date with the meta and make you a better player. So if you want to improve at WoW and take your game to the next level, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell to be notified the moment we release more premium guides just like this one. And if you're hyped for this one, let's try to get it to 2,000 likes. Alright, enough building up. Let's jump straight into it. Starting off with your graphics settings, there are surprisingly a few settings in here that are vital for PvP. First, you'll want to make sure projected textures are enabled. Without this setting, you'll be unable to see parts or in some cases entire spells which appear directly on the environment. We also suggest having your texture resolution set to at least fair to make these projected textures clearer. You can clearly see here the difference between these settings and why you may struggle to see certain things if you don't use these settings. Another super important setting is particle density, which you'll want to have at least set to good. Having this setting too low can make it impossible to see some of the most important spells in the game. For example, having this set incorrectly will make it impossible to see Smoke Bomb, so make sure you've got this enabled. Beyond these settings, if you find yourself struggling with low FPS, the best settings to lower are view distance and shadow quality. Next up, we're taking a look at sound. Through our research, we were shocked at how many inexperienced players we found were not utilizing sound to their advantage in WoW PvP. From interrupts to stuns, having sound enabled lets you hear when some of the most crucial spells your opponents have are used. To make it easier for you to hear, you'll want to enable sound and then manually increase it while lowering music, ambience, and dialogue. You should also disable error speech to prevent hearing unnecessary audio files whenever you spam abilities that can't be used yet. Having your audio settings like this means you'll easily be able to hear when you've faked the mage's interrupt, grounded the paladin's hammer of justice, parried a rogue's kidney shot, and so much more. Next, we're going to go through the interface settings to make sure you've got everything set up correctly to both increase the control over your character and improve your awareness. Starting with the control settings, the big one here is sticky targeting. Enabling this simply prevents you from de-targeting your target if you click on the ground. While this may not seem important, it's entirely possible for you to be faced with this situation. For example, when utilizing double mouse click to move, an accidental left click on the ground will cause you to lose your target. Among other potential scenarios, it's just a safe bet to have this enabled. Moving down into combat, there are a handful of settings which help with both control over your character and awareness of what's happening in the game. First, you'll want to make sure target of target is enabled. This setting is vital for figuring out who a target might be casting into. We say might because you can usually only rely on this information for damage dealing spells, as crowd control is generally cast onto a focused target or with an arena 1-2-3 macro. Still though, you can rely on target of target casts to figure out who an incoming lava burst or chaos bolt might be going into. Next, loss of control alerts is a big one. This makes it significantly easier to see exactly what crowd control has been used on you and how long it's up for, ultimately helping you with your awareness. Many years ago, players actually used an add-on for this, but since Blizzard built it into the default UI, that's no longer necessary, and you'll just need to enable this setting. While both the target of target and loss of control alert settings help with improving your awareness, the next few settings assist with control over your character. First, make sure both focus cast and self cast key are set to none. This is something we'll touch on in a future video, but you basically want these settings to prevent issues with key binding later on. The last setting you'll want here is to enable auto self-cast. This helps prevent the need to create macros to use abilities on yourself while targeting enemy players. For example, having Blessing of Freedom bound without a self-cast macro will allow you to automatically freedom yourself while targeting an enemy if you have auto self-cast enabled. There's just one major downside we need to mention here though, and that's when playing with a priest on your team. This is because if a priest uses mind control on your target as you attempt to utilize the auto self-cast, you'll actually cast your spell on the enemy team. So just be aware of this issue if you're against making self-cast macros. Next up, the only important setting in display is status text, which you'll want to set as either numeric value or both. By usually comparing their health stat to yours, you'll usually know who outgears who. And percentage helps with knowing when a target will drop into execute range, which can be important for some classes, especially those who get a damage increase on an ability as opposed to straight up access to an execute like warriors. Social settings aren't too important, but if you're looking for some recommended settings, you can follow these. The only one worth mentioning here is display only character achievements to others, which sort of lets you play in an incognito mode by preventing the character with that setting from being linked to the other characters on your account via achievements. Next, in the action bar settings, we suggest enabling both the bottom left and right bar, and then only enabling the right bar and right bar 2 if needed. With that being said, we'll be discussing this in future detail in our key binding guide, which will cover the entire process on how to correctly set up your action bars and keybinds from start to finish. So for now, just make sure you've got show numbers for cooldowns enabled. Doing so helps you see exactly how long you have left on the cooldown of your abilities. This one is really tough to play without, and much like the loss of control alerts from earlier, there used to be an add-on for this one too, but being part of the default UI now means enabling this setting is enough. Moving on to the name settings, there are quite a few important ones here that both help with control and awareness. First, you'll want to make sure you enable always show nameplates. These are vital for seeing exactly who is positioned where, and so you should want to have them on all the time. We then suggest enabling larger nameplates. Although this can be seen as personal preference, having these larger makes it easier to click on them when needed. And speaking of clicking on nameplates, you have a choice to make with the nameplate motion type, which can impact how easy it is to click on nameplates in some scenarios. Overlapping makes nameplates a more accurate source of information on the exact position of your enemies, as they'll be positioned where enemies actually are. However, it can make it tricky to quickly click on an important nameplate when enemies are stacked and moving around. Alternatively, stacking nameplates will make it easier to quickly click on a specific nameplate when enemies are stacked. And there are some scenarios in which you need to be able to quickly click on a nameplate. For example, being able to instantly click on a grounding totem to kill at the moment it's used. Now, while overlapping nameplates is better in practice, and we do recommend using it, if you find yourself having a hard time quickly clicking on important nameplates when enemies are stacked, feel free to try out stacking nameplates and see if it works better for you. Next, you'll also want to make sure nameplates are actually enabled for the right targets by enabling enemy units, which lets you see enemy player frames, and minions to see the aforementioned totems along with pets. Minor enemies can then be set based on personal preference. Just note that it can be annoying to have this enabled when playing against demonology warlocks because of the number of imps. And friendly players is an option mostly useful for healers, as it gives them an easier time seeing exactly where their teammates are and what their health is. Last up in names, we have an optional and personal preference setting, the personal resource display. This can make it easier for you to see resources like combo points and holy power, while also making it easier to see your health and mana. However, it does duplicate information that can be found on other nearby frames, and so it isn't necessarily recommended, but can be used if you're more comfortable with it. Next, the camera settings comes with one extremely important option that impacts how you can control your character in such a way that it increases your awareness. This might sound strange, but having your camera following style set to never adjust camera allows you to move forward or strafe in one direction while facing your camera in the opposite direction, allowing you to see things you otherwise wouldn't be able to see. Being able to do this allows you to see exactly where your enemies are positioned, even when moving away from them. An excellent use case for this is when facing a resto druid as a rogue. You can make it seem like you're moving away from the druid to get them out of bear form, and then instantly shadow step and kidney shot the moment you see them leave bear form. Without this setting, it's impossible to look in the opposite direction that you're moving in without your camera resetting back behind you, which hinders your ability to gather information around you. Moving on to the mouse settings, although you can enable mouse sensitivity and adjust it here, it's usually better to pick up a gaming mouse and adjust the DPI in your gaming mouse's software. The only setting that's worth playing around with here is the mouse look speed, which you'll need to have at a comfortable point that makes it easy for you to quickly and accurately rotate your camera when needed. Last up, we have the raid profile settings. Many players often mistake these for being an add-on, but they are in fact a part of the default UI. Start by enabling Use Raid Style Party Frames. Now these are honestly the best frames around, and by enabling this setting, you make it significantly easier to see your teammates' health, mana, buffs, and debuffs. We then highly recommend having the sort by option set to group. You should then make use of a script to make sure your frame is always last, which makes it easier to use Party 1 and Party 2 macros without worrying about who is the group leader. Without this script, you might find yourself accidentally using party macros on the wrong target if you're used to the top player being party 1 and the second being party 2, as your frames won't always represent this order without using these settings. We've got the script linked in the description as an add-on, so be sure to download it to get everything set up correctly. As for the actual display settings of your raid frames, we recommend going with these settings, which have you enable everything except for display border and, the more important, display only dispellable debuffs. Having this enabled will prevent you from seeing important buffs such as crowd control in your healer, so make sure to keep it disabled. With that being said, we will be looking into debuffs more closely in our follow-up add-on video, so don't worry too much about this for now. The last raid profile setting you want to adjust is to maximize the frame height and width. Although you can play around with this to find what you prefer, maximizing it is recommended to make it easier to see everything, something that will again be important in our follow-up video when we start to include add-ons. Now that we've got the best system and interface settings, it's time to take a look at the best practices for setting up your frames. Before we do anything though, you'll want to head back into system and then graphics in order to pick up an optimal UI scale, as you'll need to reposition all of your frames once you've got the UI scale you want. So what does the UI scale do? Well, it allows you to increase the size of all frames, most importantly your unit frames, buff frame, and action bars. Doing so makes it easier to see the information you need to see at a glance. We recommend going with a 9.0 UI scale on a standard 22 to 24 inch monitor with a 1920 by 1080 resolution, but you can feel free to set this to whatever feels good. The only thing that matters is that you can easily see things like buffs and debuffs on your frames. Really, the only thing you need to avoid here is having a low UI scale on a large monitor. That is definitely a no-go, as you will struggle to quickly get the information you need. After deciding on your UI scale, we're actually gonna have you download the add-on Leatrix Plus. Now, we did say our follow-up guide is gonna be all about getting you set up with the best and most important add-ons for PvP. However, you'll want to grab Leatrix Plus early on for a handful of quality of life changes that prevent the need to use scripts, including having this add-on manage the position of most of your frames across all characters, meaning you'll only have to